All right, welcome everyone. We're going to be talking a lot about bourbon today. And as you can see in front of you, we have some poured out already. So this is Consumer Direct SmartCredit presents Exploration of Bourbon. We're excited to be joined here by one of our premier partners, Top Flight. So thank you guys for joining us here today.
We're excited, yeah.
Yeah, I will be your tour guide on this adventure. My name is Scott Pollers, for those of you that don't know me. And I'm also a, thank you. I'm a certified spirit specialist and also a bourbon steward as well. So hopefully I can answer most questions you have on bourbon, as well as any of the other relatives or members of the spirits family. To start it off, we're just going to go, hey, where did bourbon get started? And I think it's, apropos that we're talking about bourbon on the eve of 4th of July weekend coming up here, because bourbon has a lot to do with our nation's founding. Prior to 1776, the big drink in the United States was rum. Rum was the big drink. The sugar was grown down in the Caribbean. It was transferred up to the northern colonies in Massachusetts as molasses, and we turned that molasses into rum. Well, once we kicked the British out, they stopped sending us the molasses, and they stopped sending us, the ingredients to make rum. So we needed to find something else to make. Also, around that time, when the nation was being founded, a lot of people wanted land, and there wasn't enough land for everyone. Well, we just had opened up a new area of the country, and that's what this picture here is in reference to. This is Daniel Boone opening the West, for those of you that remember history class. So Daniel Boone, he went out there, he made a path through the Appalachian Mountains, he carved a trail into what today is known as Kentucky. Now back then when he was doing this was just Western Virginia, not West Virginia yet, but just Virginia just extended like very far and encompassed all of Kentucky. Kentucky wouldn't become a state until 1792. So you got Daniel Boone out there, he's opening the West. You got a lot of people that don't currently have land. They just fought for this new country. They want land. There may be new arrivals that arrived to fight in the Revolutionary War, or new arrivals that came just after the Revolutionary War, and they're primarily of Scottish and Irish descent. So they know how to make whiskey. Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey being around for about 100 years prior to this. When they opened up the land, they learned very quickly that a lot of stuff doesn't grow there. Rye, which we had started making rye whiskey after we couldn't get rum, rye didn't really grow there that well. Wheat and barley grew okay, but wheat and barley you can use for bread, you can use to eat, you can use for other stuff. What they did find from the Native Americans, something that did grow really well there, was corn. Corn grew fantastic there. The problem with corn at the time is, Coca-Cola hadn't been invented, and we didn't have a real use for high fructose corn syrup, or Cheetos, or corn pops, or any of the stuff we use corn today for, popcorn. So really, people grew corn because it could grow really well, but they didn't really like consuming it, and they didn't have a lot of recipes for it. So they would use it for pig feed and to feed the animals. And what they quickly learned is, hey, we can grow a bunch of corn, and we can convert that corn into booze. We can convert it into alcohol. We can use our Scottish and Irish descent to distill it into alcohol. What that does is it allows you to take the crops that you've grown for a season, turn it into alcohol, and that alcohol then becomes a currency. It's a stored currency, because that alcohol is not going to go bad. And it's something you can store for many seasons, and it's something you can also trade and barter with other people around. Well, you can only trade and barter with stuff for so long before you actually need to ship it somewhere, and we'll get to that in a sec. But one of the other things, so bourbon's mainly made of corn, which grows really well in this new area. The other stuff bourbon is made of is, you can see up here, is rye and barley. You need a certain amount of rye and barley really to give bourbon that depth of flavor, that kind of spiciness. Otherwise, it's just going to be too sweet, and it's just going to taste a bunch like corn. But the rye, the barley gives it the depth of flavor. Another thing this new area of Kentucky has a lot of is excellent water. So Kentucky sits on kind of a limestone layer that the water naturally filters through. So you get this nice mineral limestone layer of water that is all over Kentucky and makes a great base, to make your beer, to distill your spirit in. Today, scientifically, we know that okay, there's minerals and there's a pH balance, and we can essentially replicate that everywhere. Many people do for their bourbons. But most bourbon is still primarily made in Kentucky. 95% of all bourbon is still made in Kentucky. And primarily they will always cite, it's the water. The water's, what's doing it. So we got corn, we got water, we got a little bit of barley and rye. So now what are we gonna do with it? We're gonna throw it into our column still. You can see a large picture of that. Well, first we're gonna make a beer out of it. And so you see these large open vats here. You take what's called the mash bill, or the recipe for bourbon, and you take that recipe of mostly corn, a little bit of rye, a little bit of barley, and you make a porridge out of it, you add yeast to it, and you ferment it. It essentially becomes a beer. You'll notice there's no safety nets or nothing hermetically sealed in here. Literally bugs fall in there. You can stick your finger in it. I took this is a picture I took on my tour. I'm as close as you guys are here, The reason for that is it all gets distilled. So whatever goes into it, it really doesn't matter too much. Yeah, a couple bugs here and there. But then it's going to go into what you see over here is a column still. And the column still, these things are massive at some of these large distilleries. They're 3 to 4 stories tall. That's what's going to distill it down to get that white liquor. And then once you take that liquor, you throw it in a barrel and age it for several years in one of these rick houses here, large open story building. And then you're going to get bourbon after a while. There's some other steps, but we'll get into that. What I know y'all want to do is start tasting it, right? You've heard me talk for about 9 minutes now, or a couple minutes now, and so let's get to tasting. We're going to start with the Buffalo Trace bourbon, so you'll see it there on your mat, and we're just going to kind of follow some of these tasting techniques. So what we're going to first start with is just gently swirl it in the glass. You don't have to be too vigorous about it. You just gently swirl it. You're looking at the color clarity of it. You can see it's filtered. You can see all of these have a very similar color to them. Although I'm sure if you tried, you could see gradients between them. So they're all falling in that amber golden color. What a bourbon should be, right? If you pick up bourbon and it doesn't look like this, and yeah, probably not. But we'll also get to that. It could be. When you swirl it around, you're kind of looking at the tendrils coming down the glass, and the little tails. That's going to show how viscous or thick it is. If it has more sugar, more sweetness, it's going to be a thinner kind of lines coming down, or thicker lines coming down. If it's kind of thin, it's just going to drop pretty quickly. Like Jack Daniel's drops pretty quickly. So the more good stuff in there, the thicker it's going to be, and so you're kind of looking at that. Next, you're going to smell it, but just the top of it, and just a slight smell. You're not sticking your nose in there. You're not inhaling it. That's going to throw off. Yeah, that's going to throw off your olfactory senses. So that's why I said, gently nose the top. Do not inhale deeply. Next thing you're going to do is you're just going to take a sip of it. So you're just going to take a little sip of air as you sip it, and you can see on the first one, just going to go ahead and coat your tongue and mouth, allow the spirit to warm, and swallow slowly. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, and then finally exhale. So you're exhaling through both your mouth and your nose if you can. And that's gonna hit all of kind of your olfactory senses. and allow you to completely taste the spirit. You'll notice what I put up there is nose, palate, finish. Those are standardized tasting terms. If you read a lot of like bourbon review, bourbon websites, they'll tell you, oh, this is the nose, like what they're smelling as they pick it up. Oh, this is the palate. This is how it tastes on the palate. And then here's some flavors you pick up on the exhale. And so for the second and third sip, like I said, you're just trying to examine the flavors a bit more, and you're just trying to pinpoint those flavors. So you can see this is what we're tasting right now. It's a Buffalo Trace. Buffalo Trace is one of the oldest bourbon distilleries that's still operational. They, in their marketing terms, they say, hey, back to 1775, they surveyed the site, and we found some distilling equipment that people distilled back there back in the day. Really, I think around the early 1800s is when the first true distillery got started there. But basically, people have been distilling in that location since before Kentucky was a state. And then it's been an operational distillery since then. It was one of the few that survived Prohibition by distilling medicines, and then made industrial alcohol during World War II. So kind of the brands are new. So the Buffalo Trace brand is only from 1999, but the facility itself has kind of always been there doing stuff. Frankfurt Distillery. Yeah, because it's right there.
Okay.
Yeah, and then before that, there's a couple other ones, but the official name is Frankfurt Distillery. And then you can see they also produce the Blanton's line and the Pappy line. So the famous Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, that's where it's produced today. Some notes you may have picked up: caramel, toffee, cinnamon, a little spice, a little tingling on the tongue, vanilla, oak. This one's one of my favorites. I do drink it neat sometimes. That's what we're doing right now. Today we're just drinking it straight, drinking it neat, room temperature. And you have water there if you need to take a swig afterwards. You can also try putting it's tough in this setting, but you can try putting a little dab of water in there, and it will open up the spirit as well. I prefer this as my mixing brand. So usually when I make my old fashions, usually when I make my Manhattans or anything that calls for bourbon, I usually always have a Buffalo Trace bottle on hand for any mixing. And the parent company is the Sazerac company, and they also make Sazerac rye, and they've been around since the early 1800s, dating back to New Orleans, which we're going to talk about a little bit right now. So, as I mentioned earlier, we got bourbon, we got corn, we're starting to distill stuff, we're starting to make stuff, we're trading it around. Eventually, you run out of people to give this stuff to in Kentucky because everyone's growing corn and everyone's making, distilling it into a product. It hasn't quite gotten the name bourbon yet. What they're doing with this product is they're putting it on flat bottom boats, barges essentially, and they're floating them down the Ohio River and then floating them down the Mississippi River, and then they're ending up in New Orleans. And what's in New Orleans? Bourbon Street. Yeah. And also Thomas Jefferson may have named a county in Kentucky Bourbon. So between the Bourbon County, the Bourbon Monarchy, and the Bourbon Street, that's where bourbon kind of gets its name. There's no official sanctimonious, this is where bourbon got its name. It's a conglomeration of a couple things of how it got its name. But eventually people in New Orleans were like, hey, give me some of that whiskey that's found on Bourbon Street.
Got it.
Bourbon whiskey. That's kind of where it comes from. I think an interesting fun fact, I'm not sure if we played it on the reel, that coming into this, the modern day Bourbon County, which is a smaller Bourbon County than what existed historically in Kentucky, no bourbon is made there. No distilleries exist, no bourbon is made in modern Bourbon County. Now, the historic Bourbon County, bourbon is still made there because it encompassed 30 or 50 counties. Yeah, it was way bigger. Yeah, and then they condensed it. But yeah, modern Bourbon County, no actual bourbon being made there. So it's floating down the river. They're using barrels. Barrels were, an expensive kind of commodity back then. So you would reuse barrels. You'd get a barrel full of fish or other, vegetables, crops, And you're like, God, I want to reuse this barrel, right? Well, I can't stick bourbon in the fish barrel, so what are we going to do? We're going to put fire through it. We're going to char the inside of the barrel, get rid of all that fish flavor, get rid of all that, whatever nail, whatever we transported in there. And we're going to get rid of that. And so it's going to be a charred barrel, and then we're going to stick our bourbon in it, and then we're going to float it down the Mississippi. Well, that's going to take a good 6-7 months to get down the Mississippi, and then it's going to sit in the barrel until it's done, because that's how they transport. They just transport a bourbon in the barrel. It's sitting in the barrel. So what is it doing all this time? It's aging. It's aging naturally, not on purpose, though. But by the time it gets from Kentucky down to New Orleans, it's this nice, amber-looking color you see here. It's got some of those wood flavors and char flavors, and people are really digging it. They're really liking it. They're finding it as a good alternative to the favored spirit at the time. Pretty much the favored spirit at the time up until probably World War II, quite honestly. Which is, does anyone know? No. No. Cognac. French cognac is pretty much the chief of spirits from like inception of spirits up until Scotch kind of takes it over in the post-World War II. And Scotch kind of not replaces it, but kind of comes side to side with the, that fanciness of cognac. If you Louis the 13th cognac still goes for, several $1,000s a bottle, and yeah. So, bourbon at the time has a lot of similar flavors to cognac. It's a lot cheaper. It's produced in America, so people start shifting to bourbon in New Orleans. And like I said, it's coming by via barrels, via the char.
So is this clear going in then?
Yes. All spirits are clear. That's a good question, Carl. Thank you. All spirits come off the distillery as a clear liquid. They only get their color via two ways. One, you artificially add it, which you can't do to bourbon. We'll get to in a second. Or two, it's the barrel. And most often it's the barrel. Unless, like I said, it's like your what is it, Captain Morgan rum? That's not the barrel. They throw caramel coloring in there.
What if it doesn't come out distilled clear?
Huh?
What if it doesn't come out distilled?
It always comes out distilled clear. Like you keep distilling it. Like there's no way it doesn't come out distilled because it's literally evaporates. It evaporates, and then you're collecting that evaporative liquid. So.
And that evaporative liquid is clear.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's the distillation process essentially. You're taking beer, you're taking this corn beer that you've made, and you're heating it up, and then as it heats, the alcohol is going to heat quicker than the water, and so you're taking that alcohol and you're taking some of the flavors that come along with it, and then you're collecting it over here, and then you're taking that stuff and throwing it in the barrel.
Right.
And what we do today. Because we don't ship stuff down we do still ship stuff down the Mississippi, but we don't ship bourbon until it's finished down the Mississippi today, is we age it in rick houses, which I kind of mentioned on a previous slide. So these are anywhere from 3-story to 7-story wooden structures. They're not really finished wooden structures. They're kind of open to the elements. This is a picture I took. I think it's from probably the Wild Turkey rick house. You can see the light coming in is sunlight. It's just open. It's very similar to a barn. It's got a dirt floor. It's got wooden levels. These things collapse. These things catch on fire. And you can imagine when one of these goes up, it's like, yeah. So Heaven Hill Distillery had a couple of them catch on fire a couple decades ago now. But yeah, it was a big deal. They've started implementing more safety protocols into them now, some sprinkler systems and some warning systems, because it's a lot when one of these collapses or catches on fire. But as you can see here from Heaven Hill, the warehouse is not the same temperature at the same time, even in the same month or same season. There are certain areas of the warehouse that are very hot, and there are certain areas of the warehouse that are very cold, and there are certain areas that kind of meander in between. That means the bourbon is aging at different rates, depending on where it's stored in those warehouses. So there's two things you can do to kind of combat that. One is you can move around the barrels. That's what Maker's Mark does. They move every barrel from top to bottom as it kind of ages. So it gets more, more temperature fluctuation at the top when it's young, and then fewer fluctuations at the bottom when it's older. Or you can do what other distilleries do, like Wild Turkey and Heaven Hill, is they just kind of leave it where it is, and then when they make their bourbon at the end of it, they'll take a barrel from the top and a barrel from the bottom and a barrel from the middle, and they'll blend them all together until it kind of tastes like what they're looking for. It's all depending on where you want your consistency to be. And what the barrel does is it gives you a lot of those wood flavors. So all those flavors of like vanilla and caramel and creme brulee and coffee and some of the pepper spice, coconut, those are all coming from the barrel. That is not coming from the liquid that comes off the still. And that's why you'll find all of these same flavors in your rums, in your scotches, in some of your barrel-aged tequilas. You'll find these flavors as well. But they're all coming from like what's called the Maillard effect. It's the same thing when you cook your toast in the morning of how it gets that, the crispiness, and it's activating those sugars, those kind of burnt sugar flavors. What we're going to taste next is Maker's Mark 46, and what they've done is, you can see on this photo, they've actually added additional wood to the barrel. So they take their normal barrel, they take their normal bourbon, it's been in a new oak American barrel, charred, and what they're doing now is they're throwing in some staves of French oak to give it a little different twist, and they're letting that kind of soak together. I think it's only a couple of weeks. I think it's like a month or two. Because they don't want to affect the flavor too much, but they just want to give it a little extra kick that French oak gives it. And what they also do is they toast it. So they're not charring the French oak, they're just toasting it and get it at a nice toast level. And that's why it's called 46. The 46 comes from, this is the 46th stave we tried, to get it right, So it's on your sheet there, Maker's Mark 46. So this is standard Maker's Mark, just the standard stuff you always see and buy in the store. And what they've added is those additional French oak staves to it. And that's what's going to give it a little bit more of a hit of that vanilla, a little more hit of that buttery oak, a little more caramel flavoring. And you can smell, just from the smell, completely different from, not completely different, but different enough from the Buffalo Trace we just tried.
Yeah, I've noticed a little difference in the, what'd you call it?
Comes down,
Yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
It's coming down faster.
Yeah, the legs. Yeah, the little legs, the little tendrils.
More of them, thinner, and a lot quicker than
Stronger.
the first one.
Yes, Carl. Thank you for pointing it out. This is at 47%. I believe it's only 2% stronger. I think this one's at 45.
And you know what? I don't think none of us cheers to begin with, right?
All right, cheers.
Cheers to Scott and SmartCredit.
Cheers, cheers.
So you're not supposed to blow out your nose, obviously, because it burns every time I'm doing it.
Just gently sniff, Carl. Gently.
No, in and out. You gotta be gentle.
And like I said, just coat your tongue the first time, and then that second time, you can kind of start picking out those additional flavors. And feel free to, take some sips between, cleanse palate, and then. So another unique thing about Maker's Mark is they don't use rye in their recipe. So what we talked about before, we talked about corn, rye, barley, water, and then yeast, of course. Maker's Mark doesn't use rye. They use red winter wheat instead to add as their flavoring component. And you can do that. We'll discuss in just a bit of what you can and what you can't do with bourbon. Rye, it's a little softer. It's a little easier to drink. So they say, wheat is a little softer, a little easier to drink. The Pappy bourbons also are wheated whiskeys. Larceny is also another wheated whiskey from Heaven Hill Distillery. So there's a couple in the market doing wheat versus rye. It tends to be a little bit more expensive as an ingredient. Maker's Mark, I believe they grow their own wheat. They're really committed to kind of sustainability. They like controlling basically the process from start to end. They kind of have their own forests for their own barrels and their own coopers, and you'll find this with a lot of distilleries too. They either have their own barrel or a forest or coopers, or they partner with someone who sustainably build these forests and make the barrels. We kind of single-handedly keep the barrel industry alive as the U.S. I think there's something like 7.5 million barrels of whiskey in storage in Kentucky at any one time. And per law, they all have to be new oak barrels. That means we're constantly producing those barrels. So it behooves the barrel producers to manage their forests effectively, because and sustainably. And then what happens with those barrels is they end up going and feeding the other spirit industries. So Scotch makes use of a lot of the barrels. Some wineries make use of barrels. Tequila makes use of the barrels. A lot of rum distilleries make use of the barrels. Craft beer now uses a lot of the barrels. So bourbon creates the barrels, uses them once, and then distributes them out everywhere else for their future life and future consumption.
And everybody else, they're allowed to use it multiple times?
Yeah. Some they are allowed to use it multiple times, but some don't, simply because after a Scotch whiskey's been aging for 15, 20 years in a barrel, the barrel is pretty much used up. Like, it's not going to have...
The dirty diesel. The dirty one. The dirtiest of the dirty. You got all the dirty barrels. This is the dirty barrel.
I don't know.
Next slide.
Next slide. All right, so officially, what is bourbon? So bourbon is actually officially defined by Congress. It was done on May 4th, yay, Star Wars Day, 1964, like 13 years prior to Star Wars. So U.S. Congress, they passed a joint resolution, and they declared bourbon basically a distinctive spirit or distinctive product of the United States. It follows specific standards. Specifically, it must be produced in the United States. Notice they didn't say Kentucky. You can produce it anywhere in the United States. Even Hawaii, Alaska, California, bourbon can be produced anywhere. It just has to be in the US. It is made from a grain mixture that is at least 51% corn. So it has to be majority corn. That's why Maker's Mark can use winter wheat in theirs, and other companies can use rye. As long as they hit the 51% corn, you're good to go. It must be aged in new charred oak barrels. So that's what keeps that barrel industry alive, new charred barrels. This gets a little more technical. Basically, you can't over-distill it. You can't over-distill it beyond 80%. What happens when you start doing that? It starts becoming vodka at that point. Vodka is distilled up to like 190 plus proof, 95%. So say, hey, keep it 160 or below. It allows you to retain that flavor. A lot of those flavor compounds. Most of your good distilleries will keep it well below that. Your cheaper bourbons will distill more to get more product, basically. Yeah, exactly. You got it. And then that brings us to the very next point up here. It must enter the container for aging, so the barrel. So it's got to enter the barrel at 125 proof. So a lot of distilleries will distill it to about like 125, 130, 140. They'll keep it around that range. So it's not entering the barrel at a super high proof. And then finally, you can water it down, but you can't water it down below 40%. You'll notice all the bourbons we're trying here are 45%. Is the minimum that we're trying here, but you can go as low as 40%.
So what's the strongest, bourbon-wise, that you know of, or what's the?
So there's some we'll get to it in a little bit, but you can buy bourbon it's called barrel proof bourbon, and it'll be like 60+% sometimes. Yeah, it'll be like 120 proof, 125, 130 proof sometimes. Rarely, but yeah, it's called barrel proof or cask strength. When we get to Old Forester, you can see this one's 115 proof. So that's getting up there, and that one is kind of like off the barrel. Like that's kind of what it comes, or some of it is what it comes out at, and then some of it they just make it to that point. There's a history there we'll get to. Additional types and classifications. So that you'll notice is what defines bourbon. Do you notice anywhere on there did it say how long it has to be aged in?
That's the next question.
No. You could go to Hawaii, make a bourbon, with 51% corn, throw in some pineapples if you want, age it in a barrel for 2 seconds in a new charred oak barrel. Technically, it meets the definition of a bourbon. Probably no one's going to buy it, but it does meet the definition of it. Now, it doesn't meet the definition of a straight bourbon whiskey, and everything we've tasted here will be a straight bourbon whiskey asterisk. You'll notice that Maker's Mark kind of gets around it by saying Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey barrel finished with staves. So it starts as this, because you notice we can't add additional flavors or colorings. Well, adding those additional staves, that's kind of an additional flavor. So in the marketing term, they say, hey, it starts as a straight bourbon whiskey, and then we add this to it. And that's what allows them to kind of get that. But most everything you'll find from Kentucky, or most everything that people are making bourbon, it's going to be a straight bourbon whiskey, which means it's been aged at a minimum of 2 years. And realistically, it's been aged over 4 years, because over 4 years, you don't have to put an age statement on it anymore, which means if it's aged under 4 years, it's got to say like age 2 years, age 3 years. So most of the stuff here is aged in like the 5 to 7 year category, sometimes longer. Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. This was because back in the late 1800s, people were throwing a lot of stuff in the bourbon, and they were adding a lot of like additives like prune juice and caramel coloring and just whatever, just to kind of juice it up. Well, the bourbon producers at the time were like, hey, we got to get some more control around this. So they got a Bottled in Bond Act that basically says you got to be a bonded warehouse, you got to be registered with the government, and it's got to be a single distillation. It's got to be aged for 4 years. None of this, nonsense. Yeah, and it's got to be bottled at 100 proof. You will still find some bottled in bond whiskeys today, and they'll say bottled in bond, and they'll make a big deal out of it. It's not as common anymore because the market is real. One, we have the 1964 law, we have the straight bourbon whiskey law, and it's not as big of a deal as it once was. And it's a lot of hoops to jump through for a distillery to get that bonded warehouse. Heaven Hill, most of the stuff they make is bottled in bond. You'll see it on their labels, and they're very proud of it. It doesn't mean it's better, and quite honestly, you'll notice nothing here we're tasting is bottled in bond. But it's a good marketing angle for today. And back in the late 1800s, it was gold. Like if you time travel back to the 1900s, early 1900s, look for bottled in bond stuff. You'll notice the top two have little L's after them. That's because those are legal definitions. They're legally bound to meet those. The bottom three have M's. Those are marketing terms. There's no legal ramifications around barrel proof, cask strength, single barrel, small batch. Barrel proof theoretically means it's not watered down. It's coming to you as it came out of the barrel. Does it actually mean that? Can anyone prove that? Not really. Usually what it means is it's a higher alcohol percentage by volume. So it's going to be in your 55, 60% in those range. Single barrel, it should come from one specific barrel in the warehouse, like we were talking about earlier. It should come from what are called like honey barrels, which are like the really good barrels in the warehouse that somehow got the right combination of temperature and convection and age, and they're just this like awesome bourbon. But again, it's a marketing term. It doesn't necessarily have to be. And then small batch, blend of number of select barrels. Select barrels and number. There's a small batch, which we're about to try, Four Roses small batch. Four Roses, they use about 200 to 250 barrels in their small batch. Maker's Mark, they say all their stuff is small batch, and it's all made in 20 barrel little groups basically that transfer to the warehouse together, and those 20 barrels are blended together. So they're like, oh, well, we've been making small batch since 1958. Yeah, but you didn't market it as small batch until more recently. Whereas companies like Four Roses, they're like, oh, small batch. So we'll go ahead and try that now. It is actually, even though it's a marketing term, they make good stuff.
You say this was one of your favorite ones?
It is one of my favorite ones,
Why?
yeah.
Why do you feel it's one of your favorite ones?
So it's one of my favorites because is easily available. It's got a good price point, although now it's approaching the $35 mark. I used to be able to get it for $27.
Like gas.
Yeah. It used to be in 27 to 30. Now it's in like what did I put up there? 32 to 37. All right. But it's easy drinking. It's well balanced. It's got a lot of the good classic flavors, and it's one I recommend quite frequently.
It's a little sweeter.
Mm-hmm.
Would you consider this one more, is this more of like a straight or a
Yes,
mix
yeah.
of
I do not
straight?
mix this one. No.
This is straight.
This is an ice cube.
Ice Cube changes it a little bit. I usually will just drink it straight, or what I'll sometimes do is I'll chill it a bit. I'll put the bottle in the fridge for like 15, 20 minutes just to give it a little chill. The ice will tend to, the flavors aren't super pronounced with it, so the ice tends to overpower it a little bit. Buffalo Trace you can drink on ice, that's great. This one you can drink on ice, that's great. The ice, I feel, kind of destroys the Maker's 46. You get a real grassy flavor after you throw the ice in there. It destroys some of the sweetness and the flavor balances there. If you make like the clear ice, if you have like one of those clear ice makers or something, fancy ice makers, this does real well with that. Fridge ice, your mileage may vary.
These little silver bullets, right? That we put in the freezer.
Yeah,
So it's-
yeah, those work well.
water?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
cold, yeah.
Yeah, just to give it a little chill.
A little chill,
Yeah. So yeah, this was a little bit more mellow. You get a little bit more of those berry flavors in there. You still get the caramel, toffee, oak. It's well balanced. It's got a rich. It tastes it tastes a little bit more sophisticated, I think, than the Buffalo Trace. But because of that, it doesn't mix as well. So that's why I keep the Buffalo Trace on hand for mixing, because the subtleties of this one just get destroyed in a cocktail. Interesting thing about Four Roses, so you notice I put the parent company on everything. The parent companies, conglomerates basically own everything. So this one's owned by Kirin Holdings. They're the same people that make Kirin beer from Japan, same company. You notice Maker's Mark was owned by Beam Suntory, so same. Jim Beam owns Maker's Mark. Suntory Whiskey, Yamazaki Whiskey, Japan, they're one company. They own that one. So a lot of these large companies will buy up smaller and smaller holdings. Four Roses is real big on the yeast. So they make 10 different mash bills, so 10 different recipes. Maker's Mark uses one recipe, and then they just take that and add wooden staves and kind of wood flavorings to it with their aging techniques. Buffalo Trace has 3 different mash bills. They have the one they use for Buffalo Trace. They have another one they use for, I forget if it was Eagle Rare or one of their lines. Blanton's, I think, use one line. Buffalo Trace uses one line. And then they have their weeded line that they use for all the pappy stuff. So these guys have actually 10 distinct ones that they're using, because they're using 2 different mash bills. You'll see up there, one of them has more corn and less rye. The other one has a little bit less. You can see there's a 75, 25, and then there's a 65, 35, 5. A 60, 35, 5, excuse me. And through those 2 mash bills and 5 yeast strains, they mix and match the bourbon that they get from that. So one of the yeast strains will produce something that's more fruit forward. One of the yeast strains will produce something that's more spice forward. One of the yeast strains will produce, something more that's more herbal. And so then they'll take those different yeast strains and those different barrels produced with the different yeast strains and then blend them together to make their various products. So Four Roses, just the bottom, the regular Four Roses is a blend of all 10. This one is a blend of just 4 of those 10 recipes. And then when you get a Four Roses single barrel, that's just one of the yeast recipes. So that's why sometimes the single barrel can have a vastly different flavor than a small batch. And I've tried both a single barrel and a small batch. I've tried multiple single barrels, and sometimes it's, in my mind, better than the small batch, and then sometimes it's worse, and it's just the yeast strain that they use and my personal taste preferences, quite honestly.
What about with like a Jack Daniel's single barrel, or is it the same thing, or just okay?
I don't honestly know. We'll get to Jack Daniel's in just a sec. Very next slide. So Jack Daniel's is technically a bourbon and not a bourbon. And I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of the Jack Daniel's line personally, so I don't have a lot of knowledge on them, but I do have some knowledge on Tennessee whiskey. So Tennessee whiskey is essentially bourbon made in Tennessee, and then they put it through this additional process. And that additional process you'll see below there is what's called the Lincoln County process. It's you charcoal maple filter the distillate, stuff coming off the still, prior to putting it in the barrel. Well, most bourbon manufacturers say, that's adding additional flavor. You can't call it straight bourbon whiskey anymore. But it still technically, legally, would be considered a bourbon because it doesn't violate those bourbon laws, which is why for export purposes, exporting it qualifies as a bourbon. And other countries internationally will sometimes refer to it as a bourbon. Technically, not incorrect because it does fall into all those. Now, Tennessee, specifically the state, does have some laws that say you have to make Tennessee whiskey in Tennessee, and it has to follow this process, and it has to, it still has to be like the 51% corn, all the bourbon stuff in Tennessee, Lincoln County process, made in Tennessee, except if you're Pritchard's. Because Pritchard's has been making whiskey in Tennessee since the end of the Civil War, and they don't use the Lincoln County process, but they're still considered a Tennessee whiskey. And so the state law has an exclusive amendment to allow them to be called a Tennessee whiskey without using the process. But everyone else has to use the Lincoln County process. All right, rye, another bourbon relative. It's essentially bourbon, but it's 51% rye instead of corn. But it follows a lot of the same processes. It has a lot of the same history associated with it as well. And it's produced by a lot of the same companies. You'll see up there, Bullet Rye also makes Bullet Bourbon. So the Sazerac company makes Sazerac Rye, literally owns Buffalo Trace. And then Rittenhouse Rye, I think it's produced by...
Taste comparable?
Very different. Yeah, so rye has a very different flavor to it. Bourbon is a lot sweeter. And maybe, remember, we use rye as a flavoring agent to give it that spice. So rye has a lot more of the spice and kind of vegetable, grassy flavors to it.
Yeah, it would be like rye is usually more spicy.
Yeah. But also, rye was produced big in Pennsylvania, big around the same time bourbon was, as this nation was kind of getting off rum and trying to find something new. Pennsylvania was growing a lot of rye up there, as was like the New England colonies. And so rye kind of got started there, but then it was quickly overtaken by bourbon. American whiskey. This is what happens when you violate one of the bourbon rules. You just turn it into American whiskey. So, yeah, it's whiskey.
Dirty barrel. Dirty barrel.
Yeah, right there. Yeah. You asked about the dirty barrels. So so if you don't want to use, if you want to make bourbon, but you don't want to use a new charred oak barrel, American whiskey. Wow. And it tastes pretty good too. I've had Michter's American whiskey. It has a roasted marshmallow flavor to it. It's pretty good. Not a lot of, you'll find American whiskey is a lot more common in the craft distilleries, the smaller distilleries. Just for quantities of scale and pricing, it's easier for them to make this kind of stuff versus the larger distilleries. There's more money to be made in making bourbon, but you'll find it around a little bit. And then we got Canadian whiskey. So Canadian parentheses rye whiskey, because sometimes Canadian whiskey will be called Canadian whiskey, and sometimes it'll be called Canadian rye, and sometimes that Canadian rye will have 0 rye in it or not a lot of rye in it. In the case when we call stuff rye whiskey, it has 51% rye. When they call it rye whiskey, it's because it has rye in it as an ingredient. or had it historically, yes, and that's where it got its name from. Historically, it was made with rye, but then we started making it with other stuff. So some Canadian whiskeys can be very similar to bourbon. They can follow the exact bourbon methodology, just made in Canada, and they would quantify as a Canadian whiskey. Or they can taste completely different from bourbon. They have to be made in Canada. They have to be aged 3 years in wood, and that's it. And then there's also this weird 9%, 9.09%, 1/11th wild card rule, where you can add anything to it as long as it still tastes like whiskey at the end of it. So people always make fun of Canada because they're like, oh, you guys put fruit juice in your whiskey. Well, yeah, historically, remember I talked about that prune juice? Yeah, you can add that in there. Today, what they add in is typically good whiskey that from earlier batches, or good aged whiskey. They're like, okay, we made this new Canadian whiskey. It's aged for 7 years. Oh, but we've got some of this 18-year stuff in, and we put a 1/11th of the 18-year stuff in with this new stuff, and then it's super special. You could do that. You can't do that with bourbon, but you can do that with Canadian whiskey. Another reason for that 1/11th stipulation is you can take 10/11ths of Canadian whiskey and throw in 1/11th of American whiskey or bourbon, and now that has a component of United States whiskey in, and when you export it or import it into the United States, all of a sudden it has a component of the United States in there. And yeah, so it's a lot.
The first quick little story I'll share with you guys, right? The first time I ever got plastered in high school was off whiskey. It was off of Black Velvet. Black Velvet whiskey.
Black Velvet.
Black Velvet. The plastic bottle.
So we'll briefly just go over Prohibition. Prohibition is one of the reasons we have that Canadian beer law. A lot of Canadian stuff was coming over the border during those years. It pretty much decimated the bourbon industry, and it was pretty much a start over. So all the brands you see here today, and anything you're drinking from bourbon-wise, is really coming post-Prohibition. They'll claim like, hey, everything. They'll claim the lineage back prior, in which it is there, but all the recipes and all the brands are post-Prohibition, post-World War II actually, because after Prohibition, most of the distilleries were converted to industrial alcohol manufacturing for the war effort. And that kind of brings us to today of what we're kind of experiencing right now, which is a bourbon renaissance. After the industry was decimated, it's taken a good 50, 60 years to get back to where it once was. It took from 1775 to 1897, that Bottled and Bond Act, to really get bourbon up to a good standard. It was there at that good standard for about 20 years, and then Prohibition kind of killed it. And today, through marketing efforts like Maker's Mark, through Pappy Van Winkle, which originally came out in 1972 and sat unnoticed for a good 30 years. Blanton's, which was the first single barrel whiskey, came out in 1984. First single barrel whiskey that was marketed. Old Forester will say they came out with single barrel whiskey first, which they did. They didn't market it as heavily though as Blanton's did. And then in 2013, Pappy basically was awarded the Liquid Gold Award in Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible. And as soon as that happened, basically it went from being a best kept secret to everyone knew about it and everyone wanted it. And the scarcity just shot up tremendously. In the early to mid 90s, you could find Pappy Van Winkle just sitting on shelves, unbought, gathering dust. But as soon as the 2009 basically happened, and going forward, after it won gold and 2013, everything changed. Also, you noticed a generational shift in the mid 90s and early 2000s, as more Gen Xers and millennials were reaching drinking age, they wanted to find something special and fun, something fancier. Yeah. All right. So last bottle today, we'll be tasting Old Forester. This is going to be a little spicier. It's 57% alcohol. It has had a chance to evaporate some. We did pour them, about an hour ago now. But it's going to be a little bit more bold. And it's the 1920 recipe. So Old Forester was one of the few distilleries that was allowed to operate during Prohibition. And they made bourbon specifically for medicinal purposes. But some of the stipulations of that is that it had to enter the barrel at 100 proof. And then typically through evaporation and the angel share, it would increase past that. And it would typically increase to 115, which is what you're tasting that today.
Were there other companies that were permitted that same?
Yeah, there was about 6 of them. Buffalo Trace was also, the Buffalo Trace distillery was allowed to produce bourbon, but none of the brands Buffalo Trace has today are those brands that they were actually producing. But the distillery was. So this is a brand that was produced then that is still produced today. Now, like I said, even though this brand has survived since 1870, the recipe for it has changed a lot. So, and that's what they're trying to do with these recipe series, is they're trying to get back to those old recipes and kind of resurrect them.
Okay.
You ever used to the burning sensation?
Mm-hmm.
I do it every time I breathe out. I can feel the "don't do it" kind of thing. It takes a skill.
Yeah, that's got some kick, huh?
Yeah. Wow.
A lot of peppercorn on the side, some of those cedar flavors, a little smokier. But I wanted to add it to the tasting flight here so you guys can see.
It's great with barbecue.
Yeah. You can see the differences, the variations, right? And then this one's Brown Forman. Brown Forman, as a company, pretty much only has like one bourbon recipe. They have like the 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% barley, and that's the same recipe you'll find in a lot of their other products as well. Woodford Reserve, if you've ever had that or a fan of that, same company, same recipe. Just different yeast strains, different aging locations, but yeah. So it's the kind of the Brown Forman standard recipe. Oh, and the Forester is also proud. They always put it on the first bottled bourbon. So back in 1870, like we said, we're transporting stuff in barrels. Old Forester is like, what if we put it in bottles and sold it in bottles? And they were one of the first ones to do that. At the time, very expensive to do that. Most people were using reusable bottles, filling it up from the keg or the cask, and then taking it home from there. Whereas these guys were actually adding marketing and selling it in bottles. All right, I think we have a raffle that we're doing. Do we have some results from the raffle?
Who won?
Oh, look at that.
Who wins?
Right.
Got the circle.
Another round of shots. Yes.
Let's go.
It looks like Danny from the Financial ER is our winner.
All right, Danny.
Is that you? Let's hear it for Danny.
So congratulations, Danny. Cheers.
Oh.
It's another shot.
Yeah.
All right, sorry we're a little over time. I got a little enthusiastic on certain sections.
Thank you.
Any questions or anything I didn't cover?
A
Yeah.
question. So you mentioned earlier during the early days, as barrels were being shipped down the Mississippi, were comparing the transportation of these barrels from back then to now and their aging process, would moving the barrels more often change the flavor compared to if the barrels were just sitting in the, what's it called, the rick house?
Yeah. So one of the distilleries called Kentucky Artisan Distillery, they make a bourbon called Jefferson's Reserve, and it's called Jefferson's Reserve Ocean Aged. So they do an experiment where they take a bunch of barrels and they throw them on a cargo ship and send that cargo ship. The cargo ship's just going around the world, so the barrels are getting some motion from there. It's mostly a marketing gimmick, quite honestly, in my opinion. It has a little bit of a flavor profile to it, but you don't need to move the whiskey around through convection and just the temperature changes. The whiskey inside is getting sloshed around just from pressure changes and temperature changes. That it's being pushed into the barrel and it's coming out of the barrel and it's rotating in the barrel just through natural forces, essentially. So you don't need to add in the extra, shaking it up. And these barrels, like I said, I mean, Maker's Mark. You've tasted literally distilleries that don't move the barrels at all, and a distillery that moves the barrel quite frequently. And I don't know,
What's the
did
difference?
it
Yeah.
make a did it?
No.
Could you taste the barrel movement?
I tasted 57%.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, like Maker's Mark, they like I said, they start their stuff on top and they move them in 20 barrel chunks down the floor, and other ones they don't. They just leave them where they are. And yeah, and volume is how you get some of these like prestigious brands, like essentially like the Pappy brand. Like I'm sure everyone's heard of Pappy. Well, why don't they just make more Pappy? Pappy is a volume game, right? Buffalo Trace is making all this bourbon with all this mash bill, and they're storing it on all the warehouses, right? And by volume, some of these barrels are going to be really, really good. Like when you make enough of it and you store enough of it, and so they're going and they're finding these honey barrels, and then they're taking these honey barrels and you make a new brand out of it, or you try to what they did is they matched an existing brand. So there used to be like a Stitzel-Weller distillery that made Pappy. And then as they went out of business, the family that owned Pappy, they went to Buffalo Trace and they're like, hey, can you match this? And so that's what they're trying to do with their barrels. They're like, okay, well, it's easy to match the recipe, right? The recipe is right up there, 72, 18, whatever it is. They make it with wheat. The yeast is a little harder. The yeast is really what separates a lot of these, and it's like a closely guarded secret. And they keep a lot of good like scientific, making sure it doesn't mutate, so there's a lot of scientific quality control in the yeast.
Right.
And they store the yeast all around the country so that if any place burns down or it gets sabotaged, it's available in different states, geographically diverse, in case there's a tornado that just rips through Kentucky, you don't want to use your yeast starter. And the yeast is what makes, a Buffalo Trace different from a Four Roses, because you can match the exact recipe, you can use the exact materials, you can, they're all made in Kentucky, so similar climate, they're using new oak, sometimes from the same barrel manufacturers. But the yeast and then the artistic spirit of the master distillers of saying, okay, yes, this is done. This is meeting my taste for this is where you get those variances, as you can taste here. So what were your guys' favorites? What did you?
So I was gonna quick question. I was gonna see if I can get another splash of that Old Forester.
Yeah,
Possible,
it grows
so
on
I
you,
can
doesn't it?
taste that
Yeah,
one
that
time, be
that.
specific.
Yeah,
When is the next spirits trading? And what spirit are we testing? No, I'd like. I think one of the reasons why I like this one as my top was because it didn't have like that strong smell or nose to it as the other ones, and even though it burned a little bit more coming down, it
That
taste
may
wasn't
have
too strong.
So
for me,
if you're pouring it yourself, remember it has been sitting for about an hour. It was sitting about an hour before we tasted it,
Okay.
and when we drank it. And because it is higher alcohol, some of those alcohol vapors will have evaporated.
Got it.
So if you buy this yourself and you pour a glass and you drink it, your experience may differ.
Okay.
Let it let it kind of rest a little bit, or add a drop of water to it, and that'll help it.
Okay.
But yeah, this is one of those ones where like your first sip on it is like, whoa, there's a lot there. But then additional sips, you're like, oh, okay. Well, we got past that. We got past the shock, right? The alcohol shock, the burning. And then once you get past that, you're like, oh wow, this is a really good tasting bourbon here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How long from, how many years did it take for the U.S. to start taxing on bourbon? Or was it like day one?
Oh, it was pretty much day one. Yeah, it was pretty much as soon as it became a thing, like early 1800s,
Okay.
they were taxing it.
Okay.
In fact, during Prohibition, that's a funny thing.
Popper, huh?
So during Prohibition, the U.S. spent $300 million enforcing Prohibition and lost $11 billion in taxes.
How dumb is that?
Yeah, and that's why it only lasted about like 13 years. Because they're like, wow, we're losing a lot.
Already like 12 years too long.
Yeah, it is one of the contributing factors, not the only contributing factors, but one of the contributing factors to the Depression is that too.
Yeah.
Minor, but it's still there.
Should let John Dillinger alone.
Yeah, I've noticed that for some people, they rather than keeping in a bottle, they pour it into a decanter or a different type of storing vessel.
I usually do that.
What is your view on using those types of?
Yeah, you can do that. You just got to be careful. Some of those decanters are lead crystal decanters, and the longer a spirit sits in them, they'll actually like kind of leach out some of the lead in the glass. So you just got to be careful of like when it was produced and if it has lead in it, a leaded crystal. And it's okay if you throw it in a decanter and serve it for the evening. I'm talking about like leaving it in the decanter for months, especially if it gets like sunlight, starts to break down, like that. You probably don't want to do that. I personally just leave them in the bottles that they come in. I try to keep them out of sunlight, out of temperature changes. So oxygen, sunlight, temperature changes, those are the three things that are gonna degrade the quality of your spirit. But the spirits honestly are pretty hardy, so you're not gonna get a lot of degradation even with those three things. But those three things will hasten it.
Especially if you go through it pretty quickly, it's not gonna happen in like a couple months.
Yeah. But usually if it's just inside your house and it's away from the window and it's not getting direct sunlight every day and you're not, throwing the fixed fish oxygenator in there, it's pretty tough to. They're pretty hardy. It's pretty tough to destroy them.
I like the sweet one. What was the one you
This one.
you said your favorite?
This one,
Yeah.
the small batch.
Little
Yeah.
sweetness to it.
Yeah, that one, like I said, it's one of my favorites. It's one I recommend. It's a good like starter bourbon. I don't know a lot of people that don't typically enjoy it.
Yeah.
From there, you'll typically want to I want to experiment with higher alcohol or more rye or different wood flavors. But it's a pretty solid one.
In terms of categorization of the whiskeys, if let's say a specific, let's say a rye whiskey, right, or a distiller tends to do the same like process and ingredients, but let's say the outcome of that process of that product is completely different from the rest of it, would it still be considered one of them?
Yeah. So as long as you follow the rules, as long as you follow the process, it qualifies at it. Like I've had bourbons that don't taste anything like bourbons, and I'm like, what is this? This is nonsense. You taste these four together, and then you taste like Jim Beam like Black Label or Jim Beam White Label next to it, and you're like, is this really a bourbon? Yeah, it is, but it's it's completely different. It tastes like a very watered down bourbon compared to some of the full flavored ones.
Where do they categorize like Jameson in? Did I miss that?
Jameson is an Irish whiskey.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, that's an Irish whiskey.
Different
that-
laws, different tastes, different no barrels, maybe dirty barrels.
It follows Irish. Yeah, there's Irish laws and then there's American laws that it conforms to, and that one can have what's called neutral grain spirit in it. So it can be a certain percentage of neutral grain, basically vodka. You can throw vodka in there.
Okay.
So Jameson is kind of like 80% vodka, neutral grain spirit. Not vodka because it's not distilled that high, but it's just, yeah. And then 20% of like actually like good stuff.
Okay.
If you like Jameson and you want 100% of the good stuff, you should get Redbreast 12.
Redbreast 12.
It's made at the same distillery.
Okay.
It's just 100% of the good stuff they put in Jameson.
Redbreast 12. Okay, I'll check that out.
So Jameson only has 20% of that. This is just 100% of it.
Yeah, pure.
Yeah.
Right there by the
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
yeah. So yeah, if you like Jameson, try Redbreast 12. It'll change your life.
Thank you.
Proper 12.
Huh?
Proper 12. Same thing, Irish whiskey.
I have not tried that
I
one.
tried
From
both.
Costco?
It's Connors.
But it's
Gregor's.
from Gregor Connor's.
Yeah, it's kind of McGregor's whiskey, or his brand.
I'm always leery of celebrity spirits.
Hit and miss, man.
Yeah, very hit
So
and miss.
Casamigos, that's not a, you know.
I've tried it. I'm not a huge fan.
That I'm not
Yeah.
Terramana, come on.
There's no celebrity
That should be
tequila.
the next training.
Not
Celebrity spirit
Yeah.
training.
Yeah.
And all drinks from
Yeah.
celebrity.
Yeah.
Celebrity spirit training.
Yeah, that's
There you go.
Bro, like what, like celebrity, and then like what you would recommend is like
yeah.
crush
That's a good
Yeah,
idea.
wine.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good idea. I like that.
Let's get the rock in here. You tell
Yeah.
me you don't like
Yeah.
this tequila.
Yeah. Let's get the rock. Let's get Puffy in here. Like
tell
it's
him.
a rock.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get him off. Get George Clooney in here.
Yeah.
Let's make sure you tell him you don't like.
That's awesome.
Like I said, some are better than others,
Hagar,
but there's none that I think Casa Noble is technically had a stake in it by Santana, I want to say, back in the day. But they don't market it that much, so it's difficult to remember. But I think Casa Noble is very good tequila, and I think there is a celebrity person that's somewhat involved with it.
So Chabo's no good.
I don't prefer it. No.
Alright, go home, pour it out.
If
I think what else is any other celebrity?
I know the Breaking Bad guys have their own mezcal, like Dos Hermanos.
Dos Hermanos.
Yeah,
Okay.
I haven't tried it yet. That one might be good. It's difficult to mass produce mezcal,
Yeah,
so they're
mezcal,
probably sourcing it from some people that are actually making very good mezcal.
Right.
That I might trust a little more, but I personally haven't tried it.
Yeah, that was crazy.
All right, go. Well, cheers
All
to
right.
you, Scott. Thank you, man.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Great training.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Cheers.
Appreciate the knowledge as always.
Tell us where we need to go next. Where's the next spot?
You're not driving for 5
No.
hours.
If you ever get a chance to visit Kentucky, I would recommend visiting Maker's Mark Distillery. It's kind of like the Disneyland of distilleries. It's a great visit. The grounds are immaculate. I'd also recommend Woodford Reserve. I like their bourbon. It's not the greatest. We didn't try it today. I think there's other better stuff at similar price point. But their facility is a very nice visit.
What's the significance of the top? I always want to ask that if you know of the maker.
Oh yeah. There's a so Maker's Mark is basically an experiment in branding. So it was designed to be expensive. It was designed to be upmarket. It's why it's one of the bourbon brands that survived from the 50s through the dark days of the 70s and 80s. Is because while other bourbons were going lower shelf, bottom shelf, Maker's Mark intentionally went upmarket. So they intentionally wax sealed their bourbon bottles to give it that little bit of extra, zing to it. They intentionally designed their logo with the maker's signature and a star. I think his wife designed the logo, but they intentionally created a craft product, an upmarket product. Their marketing line for the longest times was it tastes expensive because it is, and it's one of the reasons they survived essentially unchanged since 1958. They make their one bourbon recipe. And then the newest thing they added was this in 2010. This is the newest thing they added was in 2010. They took their main recipe, they threw some oak staves in it. Today they're doing a lot more experimentation with oak staves. You can get them to make your own barrel and choose the woods you want to put in there to kind of customize your flavor profile, and they'll kind of do that for certain bars and certain distributors as well.
Yeah, I read a while back when they marketed off, I believe it was the 4 W's, and it was water, wheat, wood, and wax.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
something
yeah,
like, something
yeah,
like
very-
that, right?
yeah,
It's not in
yeah.
those four. So they stood behind those
Yeah.
four products like strong, and that's where they.
Yeah. I was a maker. I'm a Maker's Mark ambassador. I got to go to their facility there in Loretto, Kentucky. I got a barrel. I got a bottle from my barrel. My name was on a barrel. I got to wax dip my own bottle. It's at home.
So that's cool. I
It's,
got the opportunity to do that in Puerto Rico at the Bacardi factory.
Okay, there we
got to
go.
Pour the rum. It was rum out of the barrel, and we got to seal it. Put our initials. Pretty cool.
Yeah,
I got
yeah.
his name.
Yeah, so it's a great experience. And yeah, they really they've had this whole craft marketing thing before the craft marketing caught up to them. And they were like, oh yeah, small batch, yeah, we've been doing small batch. Oh yeah, the craft product, yeah, we've been doing a craft product. So
Yeah.
so they've been
Like we've
ahead of
been
the
here the whole
curve.
time, everybody's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
excited about all this. Drink some Maker's Mark, suckers.
Yeah.
That's what they're saying.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for
All
attending.
right, let's go.